Marry a stranger in 72 hours, or lose your daughter. When Emily Carter heard those words, she thought her life couldn't possibly get any worse. She was wrong. 3 days earlier, the 29-year-old single mother had been balancing 2 jobs just to keep a roof over her head in Portland, Oregon. Every morning began before sunrise and ended long after dark. Between waitressing at a family diner and cleaning offices downtown, she barely earned enough to cover rent, groceries, and school supplies for her 6-year-old daughter, Sophie. It wasn't the life Emily had dreamed of, but every sacrifice felt worth it whenever Sophie smiled. That Tuesday afternoon, Emily received a phone call that turned her world upside down. Her Aunt Margaret, the only relative who had ever supported her after her parents passed away, had suffered a serious medical emergency. By the time Emily rushed to the hospital, she learned that Margaret's condition required long-term treatment and expensive care. The bills were overwhelming. As if that wasn't enough, Margaret's attorney informed Emily of another devastating complication. Years earlier, Margaret had signed a trust agreement that named Emily as the temporary guardian of several family assets. Now, because of legal disputes involving distant relatives, Emily faced a challenge she never saw coming. If she couldn't meet specific financial and legal requirements within 72 hours, her guardianship rights over Sophie could be challenged by relatives who claimed she was unable to provide a stable home. Emily felt sick. The thought of anyone questioning her ability to care for her daughter was unbearable. She spent the next day desperately searching for solutions. She applied for loans, contacted agencies, and even considered selling everything she owned. Every door slammed shut. Her credit history wasn't strong enough. Her income wasn't high enough. Her savings account held less than $400. By Friday morning, Emily sat in her aging sedan outside Sophie's elementary school, gripping the steering wheel as tears threatened to fall. Sophie climbed into the back seat carrying a construction paper project, decorated with glitter stars. "Look, Mommy," she said proudly. "I made us a family picture." Emily turned around and forced a smile. In the drawing, there were only 2 people holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. Emily and Sophie. Seeing it nearly broke her heart. That evening, Aunt Margaret's attorney requested an urgent meeting. Emily expected more bad news. Instead, she received an offer so unbelievable she almost laughed. A wealthy businessman needed a temporary wife as part of a private legal arrangement. The marriage would satisfy requirements benefiting both parties. In return, Emily would receive enough financial protection to secure Sophie's future and resolve every immediate threat hanging over their lives. Emily stared at the documents in disbelief. She didn't know the man's name. She didn't know his face. She only knew one thing. If she refused, she could lose everything she had spent years fighting to protect. As she signed the visitor log and prepared to meet the mysterious stranger for the first time, Emily had no idea that the decision she was about to make would change not only her future, but the future of the most powerful man she had never heard of. Emily expected to meet an elderly businessman, someone desperate to satisfy a legal technicality. Instead, when she entered the private conference room on the top floor of a downtown office building, she found a man who looked like he belonged on the cover of a business magazine. He stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Portland's skyline, wearing a dark tailored suit and a cold expression that immediately put her on edge. He did not smile when she entered. He barely acknowledged her presence at all. For several uncomfortable seconds, he simply reviewed documents in front of him as if she were another item on his schedule. Finally, he looked up. "Emily Carter?" he asked. His voice was calm, confident, and distant. "Yes," Emily replied. "Ethan Walker." That was all the introduction he offered. Emily waited for something more, but nothing came. No handshake. No polite conversation. No attempt to make the situation less awkward. The attorney cleared his throat and began explaining. The agreement. Ethan listened without interruption. Every answer he gave was brief and precise. The man seemed less interested in marriage than he was in completing a business transaction. By the end of the meeting, Emily's frustration was growing. She understood that neither of them had chosen a traditional path, but his attitude made her feel invisible. When the attorney stepped out to retrieve additional paperwork, silence filled the room. Emily finally spoke. "Do you always act like this?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Like you would rather be anywhere else." To her surprise, he did not look offended. "I usually am. Emily folded her arms. Good to know. For the first time, a faint reaction crossed his face. Not a smile. Not quite. But something close. Before she could decide what it meant, it disappeared. The paperwork continued for another hour. Emily learned very little about him. He was private, reserved, and impossible to read. Whenever she asked a personal question, he redirected the conversation. Whenever she tried to understand why he needed the arrangement, he simply reminded her that the details were confidential. By the time the meeting ended, Emily was convinced she had agreed to marry the most arrogant man she had ever met. Outside the building, she sat in her car trying to process everything. Her phone rang. It was Sophie. "Mommy, are you coming home soon?" her daughter asked. Instantly, Emily's tension softened. "I am, sweetheart. Did your meeting go okay?" Emily glanced back at the towering office building. "I think so. You sound funny." Emily laughed quietly. That is because today was very strange. After hanging up, she drove home still unsure whether she had made the right decision. Meanwhile, several floors above, Ethan stood in his office watching the city lights appear one by one. His assistant entered carrying a folder. "Everything is ready," she said. Ethan nodded. "And the child?" "Sophie is enrolled at one of the highest-rated schools in the district if you decide to proceed." Ethan looked toward the window again. "Proceed with what?" The assistant hesitated. "The plan you have been preparing for." Ethan said nothing. But as he stared into the distance, one thought remained in his mind. Emily Carter was nothing like he expected, and for the first time in a very long while, that unsettled him. 2 days later, Emily found herself standing inside a quiet courthouse wearing a simple cream-colored dress she had borrowed from a friend. Nothing about the day felt real. There were no flowers, no family celebration, and certainly no romance. The entire event felt more like signing a complicated business contract than beginning a marriage. Sophie sat beside her on a wooden bench, swinging her legs and holding a stuffed rabbit. The little girl seemed far less nervous than her mother. "Are you okay, Mommy?" Sophie whispered. Emily forced a smile. "I think so." Before Sophie could ask another question, Ethan entered the room. As usual, he looked calm and completely in control. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, and his expression revealed nothing. Emily wondered if the man ever felt nervous about anything. The brief ceremony began. The judge reviewed the paperwork, asked the required questions, and within minutes, everything was official. Emily Carter had become Emily Walker. The words felt strange in her mind. After the ceremony ended, Ethan shook hands with the attorney and thanked the judge. Then he turned toward Emily. "A car is waiting outside," he said. "We should leave." Emily blinked. "That is it." Ethan looked confused. What else would there be? She stared at him in disbelief. "Never mind." Outside, a black luxury sedan waited at the curb. Sophie climbed inside first and immediately became fascinated by the spacious interior. "Mommy, this car is huge." Emily sat beside her while Ethan took the seat across from them. During the drive, Sophie cheerfully asked questions. "What is your favorite color?" she asked Ethan. "Blue," he answered. "Do you like dogs?" "Yes." "Do you like ice cream?" Ethan hesitated for a second. "Yes." Sophie grinned proudly. "See, Mommy? He is not scary." Emily nearly laughed. Ethan glanced toward the window, but she thought she caught the smallest hint of amusement on his face. 40 minutes later, the car entered an exclusive neighborhood filled with large homes hidden behind trees and private gates. Emily stared out the window. "You live here?" she asked. "Yes." "How?" The question slipped out before she could stop herself. Ethan simply replied, "I have done well in business." The answer only increased her suspicion. When the gates opened, Emily saw an enormous estate stretching across acres of land. The house looked more like a luxury resort than a family home. Sophie pressed her face against the glass. "Mommy, is this a castle?" Emily honestly did not know how to answer. Inside, the home was elegant but surprisingly quiet. No crowds of staff. No display of wealth for attention. Everything felt organized, controlled, and carefully maintained. A woman in her 50s greeted them warmly and introduced herself as Mrs. Bennett, the house manager. Unlike Ethan, she smiled easily. As Mrs. Bennett showed Emily and Sophie to their rooms, Emily noticed something unexpected. A fully furnished bedroom had already been prepared for Sophie. The shelves contained books for her age, art supplies, and even a small telescope beside the window. Emily stopped walking. "How did you know she likes astronomy?" Mrs. Bennet seemed surprised. Mr. Walker personally requested those items. Emily looked toward the hallway where Ethan had disappeared moments earlier. For the first time since meeting him, a crack appeared in the image she had formed. The arrogant businessman who barely spoke had somehow known exactly what would make Sophie smile, and Emily suddenly realized there was far more to her new husband than he wanted anyone to see. The following week brought a routine that felt almost impossible for Emily to understand. Every morning she expected to find evidence that her new life was temporary, that somehow the arrangement would collapse and return her to the uncertainty she had always known. Instead, the opposite happened. The estate operated with quiet efficiency, and Sophie adapted faster than anyone. Within days, the little girl had memorized every hallway, discovered the garden paths behind the house, and somehow convinced Mrs. Bennet to teach her how to bake chocolate chip cookies. What surprised Emily most, however, was Ethan. He remained reserved and difficult to read, but small details kept challenging her assumptions about him. One rainy afternoon, Emily returned from visiting Aunt Margaret at the rehabilitation center. She entered the house expecting to find Sophie watching cartoons. Instead, she heard laughter coming from the library. Curious, she followed the sound and stopped at the doorway. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor surrounded by astronomy books, while Ethan sat across from her, holding a model of the solar system. "Mars has 2 moons," Sophie announced proudly. "Correct," Ethan replied. "Can you name them?" Sophie immediately answered. Ethan nodded with genuine approval. Emily blinked in surprise. The serious businessman who barely tolerated adults was patiently helping a 6-year-old learn about planets. Neither noticed her standing there. For several minutes, she simply watched. Sophie looked happier than she had in months. Eventually, Ethan glanced toward the doorway and saw Emily. The warm atmosphere vanished instantly behind his usual composed expression. He stood. "Your daughter is very intelligent." Emily smiled despite herself. "Thank you." She asked a lot of questions. "You noticed that too?" For a brief moment, something close to amusement appeared in his eyes. Then his phone rang, and he excused himself. Later that evening, Emily received another surprise. A representative from the legal office handling her family matter called with unexpected news. Several financial obstacles threatening her guardianship case had suddenly disappeared. Important documents had been expedited. Administrative fees had already been paid. The process that should have taken months was moving forward within days. "Do you know who authorized this?" Emily asked. "The request came through a private legal team," the representative explained. "Everything appears completely legitimate." After the call ended, Emily immediately suspected Ethan. Yet when she confronted him during dinner, he barely looked up from his meal. "Did you have something to do with my case?" she asked. "Your situation required professional assistance." "That is not an answer." "Then perhaps it is the only answer you need." Emily sighed in frustration. "Why do you always speak in riddles?" Ethan calmly set down his fork. "Because results matter more than explanations." Emily wanted to argue, but she could not ignore the truth. Every problem that had threatened her future seemed to be disappearing. Not through promises, through actions. That night, as Emily tucked Sophie into bed, her daughter looked up with a sleepy smile. "I think he likes us." Emily brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. "What makes you say that?" Sophie yawned. "People do not spend time helping you learn about stars unless they care." Emily looked toward the dark hallway outside the room. For the first time, she wondered whether Sophie might be seeing something that she had completely missed. Over the next several weeks, Emily became increasingly aware that nothing about Ethan Walker added up. The more she learned about him, the less she understood. He left the estate before sunrise almost every morning and often returned long after dark, yet he never seemed exhausted. Important calls followed him everywhere, but he rarely discussed business. Expensive vehicles arrived at the house, carrying visitors dressed in tailored suits, yet meetings were conducted behind closed doors. Whenever Emily asked questions, Ethan responded with the same frustrating calm that revealed almost nothing. One Saturday morning, Emily accompanied Sophie to a community science fair at her new school. The event was filled with parents, teachers, and local business sponsors. Sophie proudly displayed a project about the solar system, while Emily helped organize materials at the presentation table. Everything seemed normal until a black vehicle pulled into the parking lot. Ethan stepped out moments later. Emily had not expected him to come. He had mentioned a work obligation earlier that week. Sophie spotted him immediately and ran across the field. "You came," she shouted. Ethan smiled, a rare sight Emily was beginning to appreciate more than she wanted to admit. "I said I would try." "That means yes," Sophie declared confidently. As they walked through the event together, something unusual happened. Several adults suddenly became nervous. A school board member practically rushed across the lawn to greet Ethan. A local business owner immediately offered him the best seat near the stage. Even the principal seemed unusually eager to speak with him. Emily noticed every reaction. "Do they all know you?" she asked quietly. Ethan glanced toward the crowd. "Some of them." "Why does everyone act like they are meeting a celebrity?" "I assure you, I am not a celebrity." Before Emily could press further, another man approached. He was dressed in an expensive suit and looked genuinely surprised to see Ethan there. "Mr. Walker," he said, "I did not realize you would attend personally." Ethan's expression immediately hardened. "I made a commitment." The man nodded quickly. "Of course." After he left, Emily frowned. "Mr. Walker?" Ethan simply looked towards Sophie's project display. "She did excellent work." The conversation ended there. Later that afternoon, Emily stopped by a coffee shop while Sophie attended a school activity. As she waited for her order, two women seated nearby were discussing local business news. One name immediately caught Emily's attention. "Walker Holdings just acquired another company," one woman said. "Their chief executive is becoming one of the most influential people on the West Coast." Emily looked up. Walker. The same last name. It could not be a coincidence. Curiosity got the better of her. That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Emily opened her laptop and searched for Walker Holdings. Hundreds of results appeared instantly. Articles, interviews, corporate announcements, financial reports. The company was enormous, far larger than anything she had imagined. Her pulse quickened as she scrolled through photographs from business conferences and industry events. Then she froze. One image showed a group of executives standing in front of a massive corporate headquarters. At the center stood Ethan, not hidden in the background, not among employees, front and center. The caption beneath the photograph made her heart skip a beat. Suddenly, Emily realized that the man she thought she had begun to understand was still hiding a secret far bigger than anything she had imagined. Emily stared at the screen long after midnight. The article remained open while dozens of questions raced through her mind. Walker Holdings was worth billions of dollars. Its influence stretched across multiple states. The company owned commercial properties, technology firms, logistics networks, and investment groups. And according to every business publication she could find, Ethan Walker was not merely an executive. He was the chief executive officer. The man she had married in a rushed legal arrangement was one of the most powerful business leaders in the country. Emily closed the laptop and sat silently in the dark. She thought about every conversation they had shared, every question he had avoided, every vague answer. Suddenly, all of it made sense. The expensive estate, the endless meetings, the respect people showed him everywhere he went. What she could not understand was why he had hidden it from her. The next morning, Ethan had already left before sunrise. Emily spent the day trying to focus on normal routines, but curiosity refused to leave her alone. By afternoon, she made a decision. She needed answers. Using information she had found online, she drove into downtown Portland and located the headquarters of Walker Holdings. The building occupied nearly an entire city block. Glass walls reflected the afternoon sunlight, while employees moved in and out through revolving doors. Emily parked across the street and stared upward. The scale alone was intimidating. Taking a deep breath, she crossed the sidewalk and entered the lobby. Immediately, she noticed the atmosphere. Security officers greeted visitors professionally. Employees moved with purpose. Large digital displays showcased company projects around the country. Before Emily could decide whether to approach the reception desk, the elevator doors opened. Ethan stepped into the lobby surrounded by several executives. The reaction was instant. Conversations paused. Employees straightened their posture. People respectfully stepped aside as he passed. Several executives waited for his approval before speaking. Emily watched in disbelief. This was not simply a successful businessman. This was a man accustomed to leading entire industries. Then Ethan noticed her. His expression changed immediately. Surprise appeared for a brief second before his usual composure returned. The executives around him followed his gaze and suddenly seemed confused by the presence of an ordinary woman standing alone in the lobby. Ethan excused himself from the group and walked directly toward her. "Emily," he said calmly, "what are you doing here?" She crossed her arms. "I think a better question is why you never told me who you really are." For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Ethan glanced toward the surrounding employees. "Not here." Minutes later, they sat inside a private conference room overlooking the city. Emily looked at him across the polished table. "You are a billionaire." Ethan sighed quietly. "That word is not important." Emily almost laughed. "Not important? Ethan, your company is everywhere. Everyone knows who you are except me." He remained silent. "Did you think I would never find out?" she continued. "I knew you eventually would. Then why hide it?" Ethan looked out the window before answering. "Because I needed someone to see me as a person before they saw everything else." His words caught Emily off guard. For the first time since meeting him, she saw something unexpected behind the confidence and control. Not arrogance, not superiority, loneliness. And as she sat there searching his face for answers, she realized the biggest secret was not that Ethan Walker was one of the richest men in America. The biggest secret was that somehow, despite all his success, he seemed more alone than anyone she had ever met. The drive home from the city felt different. Emily sat quietly beside Ethan while the skyline disappeared behind them. Neither spoke much, but the silence no longer felt uncomfortable. Instead, it was filled with questions Emily had not yet decided how to ask. For weeks, she had judged him based on what she could see. Now she was realizing how much remained hidden beneath the surface. When they arrived at the estate, Sophie rushed toward them from the garden carrying a small notebook. "Guess what?" she announced. "I got the highest score on my science quiz." Ethan immediately gave her his full attention. "Congratulations." Sophie grinned. "My teacher said I should enter the regional competition." "Then you should," Ethan replied without hesitation. Emily watched the exchange carefully. There was nothing forced about it. No obligation. No performance. Ethan genuinely cared about Sophie's happiness. Later that evening, after Sophie went to bed, Emily found herself unable to stop thinking about everything she had learned. She walked through the quiet house and eventually discovered a light shining beneath the door of Ethan's study. For a moment, she considered turning back. Instead, she knocked softly. "Come in," he said. Ethan was seated behind his desk reviewing documents. Unlike the powerful executive she had witnessed downtown, he looked tired. Not physically exhausted, but burdened by responsibilities she could only imagine. "Can I ask you something?" Emily said. He nodded. "How long have you known about my situation?" Ethan set down his pen. "Longer than you realize." Emily frowned. "What does that mean?" After a pause, he opened a drawer and removed a thin file. He slid it across the desk. Emily hesitated before opening it. Inside were copies of legal documents related to Aunt Margaret's case, housing records, financial reports, and correspondence connected to her guardianship concerns. Some documents were dated months before they had even met. Emily looked up in shock. "You knew about all of this?" "Yes." "Why?" Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Because your attorney approached one of my legal advisors." Emily stared at him. "You were involved before the marriage proposal?" "Indirectly. You could have chosen anyone." "I know." The answer hung in the air. Emily suddenly felt her pulse quicken. "Then why choose me?" For the first time, Ethan looked away. "Because every report described the same thing." "What thing?" "A woman who never stopped fighting for her daughter." Emily did not know what to say. No one had ever described her that way before. Ethan continued quietly. "Most people who came into my world wanted something from me. Money, access, influence. You were the first person who only cared about protecting someone else." Emily lowered her eyes to the file. Her emotions felt unexpectedly complicated. Before she could respond, a sharp knock interrupted the moment. Ethan's assistant entered carrying a folder. Her expression was unusually tense. "I am sorry to interrupt," she said, "but there is a situation you need to see immediately." Ethan opened the folder and his expression changed instantly. The calm confidence vanished. Emily caught a glimpse of a photograph attached to the report. Standing beside a luxury vehicle was an elegant woman she had never seen before. Then she noticed the headline printed across the page. The woman was publicly claiming she had once been engaged to Ethan Walker, and according to the article, she had just arrived in Portland determined to reconnect with him. Emily barely slept that night. No matter how many times she replayed the conversation in her mind, the image from the article refused to disappear. The elegant woman standing beside Ethan looked confident, sophisticated, and completely at home in the world he belonged to. Compared to her, Emily suddenly felt like an outsider who had accidentally wandered into someone else's life. The next morning, the atmosphere at breakfast felt unusually tense. Ethan was distracted. His phone rang repeatedly, and several messages appeared on the screen before he silenced it. Sophie, thankfully unaware of the situation, chatted happily about an upcoming science competition. Ethan listened attentively and promised he would attend, but Emily noticed the concern hidden behind his calm expression. Later that afternoon, the mystery woman arrived. Her name was Victoria Langford. Emily recognized her immediately from the article. Victoria carried herself with effortless confidence as she entered the estate. She greeted Ethan as though no time had passed since they had last seen each other. Emily watched from a distance while trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling growing inside her chest. To her surprise, Ethan did not seem pleased by the visit. If anything, he appeared frustrated. During dinner, Victoria joined them at the table. She spoke easily about charity, galas, international travel, and corporate events. Sophie remained polite but unusually quiet. Emily sensed the little girl was studying the situation carefully. At one point, Victoria smiled and said, "I must admit, I never expected Ethan to get married." The comment instantly changed the atmosphere. Emily lowered her eyes to her plate. Ethan set down his glass. "Neither did I," he said evenly. Victoria laughed. "Well, life certainly surprises us." Throughout the evening, Emily found herself withdrawing emotionally. The closer she looked at Victoria and Ethan standing in the same room, the more logical they seemed together. They shared similar backgrounds, social circles, and experiences. Emily could not stop herself from wondering whether she had simply been a temporary solution to a problem. After everyone retired for the evening, Emily stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking the gardens. The cool night air helped clear her thoughts. A few minutes later, Ethan joined her. "You have been avoiding me," he said. Emily folded her arms. "I have not been avoiding you." "You have." She sighed. "Maybe I am just giving you space." "Why would I need space?" Emily finally turned toward him. "Because Victoria is clearly important to you." Ethan looked genuinely confused. "Who told you that?" "The entire internet seems to think so." For several seconds, he simply stared at her. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. Not mockingly, not arrogantly, just genuine disbelief. "Victoria and I were never engaged," he said. "Our families hoped for it years ago. Nothing ever happened." Emily blinked. "What?" The media created its own version of the story. Relief washed through her so quickly that she almost felt embarrassed. Ethan studied her expression carefully. "You were worried." "No, Emily." She looked away. Ethan took a slow breath. "There is something you should know. If Victoria had arrived 6 months ago, I would not have cared. But things are different now." Before Emily could ask what he meant, his phone rang again. He checked the screen, and his expression immediately darkened. Whatever message had arrived was serious, very serious, and for the first time since she had known him, Ethan looked like a man preparing to sacrifice something important. The message Ethan received that night changed everything. Over the following week, Emily learned that several members of Walker Holdings' board wanted Ethan to make a choice. They believed his priorities had shifted. Rumors about his personal life were spreading through business circles, and some investors questioned whether he remained fully committed to the company. Ethan never shared every detail, but Emily could see the pressure building. He spent longer hours at the office and returned home later than usual. Yet despite everything, he never missed Sophie's science competition. On the morning of the event, hundreds of students and families filled the convention center. Sophie stood nervously beside her project while judges moved from table to table. Emily squeezed her daughter's hand. "You are going to do great." Sophie nodded, though she still looked anxious. Then Ethan appeared. He had clearly come straight from an important meeting, still wearing a suit and carrying a folder. The moment Sophie saw him, her face lit up. "You came." Ethan smiled. "I promised I would." The competition lasted hours. When the winners were finally announced, Sophie earned first place in her division. She nearly burst into tears of happiness. Emily hugged her tightly, while Ethan looked prouder than anyone in the room. For a brief moment, everything felt perfect. Later that evening, however, reality returned. Ethan gathered Emily in the study. His expression was calm, but she immediately sensed what was coming. "The board offered me a deal," he said. "What kind of deal?" Emily asked. "If I end certain personal commitments and focus exclusively on the company, several ongoing conflicts disappear." Emily understood immediately. "They mean us." Ethan remained silent. The answer was obvious. A painful knot formed in her chest. "You do not have to explain," she said quietly. "This arrangement was always temporary." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "That is not what I want." Emily froze. "What?" Ethan took a slow breath. "Months ago, I agreed to a legal arrangement. Somewhere along the way, that changed." "You changed it." Her heart raced. Ethan continued. "I spent years building companies, negotiating deals, and solving problems. None of it prepared me for coming home and finding Sophie excited to show me a school project. None of it prepared me for you." Emily could not speak. "The board believes I should choose the company over my family," Ethan said. "The problem is that I already made my choice." A week later, Ethan publicly restructured leadership responsibilities within Walker Holdings, proving the company could thrive without controlling every moment of his life. The controversy faded. The investors stayed. The business remained strong. More importantly, the uncertainty hanging over Emily's future finally disappeared. Aunt Margaret recovered steadily. The guardianship issues were permanently resolved. Life became peaceful in a way Emily had never thought possible. Several months later, family and close friends gathered in the estate garden beneath a bright summer sky. This time there were flowers, laughter, and celebration. Ethan stood before Emily holding a simple ring. "The first marriage began as an agreement," he said. "This one begins with a choice. My choice." Tears filled Emily's eyes as she said yes. Nearby, Sophie grinned from ear to ear. After the ceremony, she wrapped her arms around Ethan and looked up at him. "Can I call you Dad now?" For perhaps the first time in his life, Ethan Walker was completely speechless. Then he smiled and answered with a single word. "Always."